Today on Beyond 6 Seconds.
In an entrepreneurship class, they shared with us that immigrants actually do better in entrepreneurship because we have this drive and, thrive and desire to succeed in a way that other people don't. This is just statistically, obviously, all people do and can succeed. And I felt like that maybe this was something that I felt compelled and called to do.
Welcome to Beyond 6 Seconds, the podcast that goes beyond the 6-second first impression to share the extraordinary stories and achievements of everyday people. I'm your host, Carolyn Keel. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Meg He. Meg is the co-founder of ADAY, a direct-to-consumer brand with a mission to create a better wardrobe of clothing that does more with less. Using technical fabrics and innovative production, ADAY creates versatile, long-lasting apparel with a sustainable approach. ADAY's mission is to set a new standard for clothing and for the $1.5 trillion fashion industry. Named as one of the world's most innovative companies by Fast Company, Meg was also named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 with her co-founder, Nina Faulhaber. Prior to ADAY, she worked at Poshmark, Cowboy Ventures, and Goldman Sachs. Meg has a BA from Oxford University and an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. She lives in Brooklyn, New York, and finds flow in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, meditation, and hiking with her rescue pup, Helix. Meg, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Carolyn. It's such a pleasure to be here.
I'm so happy to have you here today. You have such a fascinating story. I understand that you were born in Beijing and then moved to Wales when you were very young. So what was that transition like?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I do still think of myself as Chinese, both ethnically and culturally, although it's been a long time since I've held a Chinese passport. I think one of definitely the earliest shocks to my system was when I realized that people in other countries actually spoke different languages. And so when my parents decided to move me, my father was already living in Wales. And my mother and I just one day we went to the airport and we got on this plane and suddenly everyone just spoke a different language. I was 5 at the time and having, come from Beijing where the whole city is full of high-rise block apartments. So I lived in a building with over 25 floors, to Wales where we moved to a little terraced building with, there were only 2 floors and suddenly there was grass and there was green everywhere and those red double-decker buses. It was a huge shock to the system and I was very confused as to why no one understood me. And I think, within that system, there were a number of things that happened. I remember that the first time I was really, really challenged, and it was by the schooling system because there was very little support for young immigrant families. So when I went to school, the teacher didn't understand why I couldn't speak English, and it was because I had only landed in the country a few weeks ago. But I think she thought I was just really stupid. So I remember the first day at kindergarten, I guess it would have been, and she gave me a book and she pointed at the words and I just couldn't say any of the words. So she had this incredibly disappointed look on her face and I still quite clearly remember it. And I went home and I felt really bad about myself because, I thought I was a good student in China and suddenly in Wales, I was just terrible, I guess.
Wow.
And when I went home, I asked my parents to sit down with me and we learned the whole book, but only phonetically because I still couldn't read it. But I could pronounce it the next day. And I turned up the next day and suddenly I could read. And she gave me a gold star. So I guess it was just, a period of quite confusing and very cross-cultural times. And especially at that time, so it was 1993 in Wales, there was just very little immigration. There definitely were other ethnicities, but they're all predominantly Commonwealth countries. And I felt very alone. And, also at that time, we lived above a Chinese restaurant. My father worked as a postgraduate researcher at Cardiff University, which was a very prestigious position to get. There were very few visas to go out of China. And he was awarded one of the few by his university to go to Cardiff. But I think we were just, desperately poor. And I think in China, we were pretty, not well-to-do, but at least middle class, I guess, or whatever that means in China. And I remember in the UK, suddenly, we were going to the ATM and withdrawing one 20-pound note. And my mother would be lecturing me over how far this money had to go because we had to buy secondhand clothing. And, she worked in a Chinese restaurant. And I think a lot of, my values around working really hard and not accepting anything at face value, and just being able to like kind of the classic immigrant story of being able to rise above it. And I think also here are some of the first times when I realized that you could also get around things by your own hacky solutions born out of need.
Oh.
So I remember my mother, her English wasn't very good and my English wasn't very good either. So she decided that we would go to church in order to meet more people and, so I could go to Sunday school and learn better English.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think, we were necessarily religious at the time, but we were very interested in like the idea of community. Like I also went to a Church of Wales school, but that's just because it was one of the better schools. And my mother got to know this head teacher of one of the better primary schools in the city. And even though we were outside of the catchment zone, I ended up going to that primary school because my mother got to know the head teacher. And I think it was a lot of like very innovative solutions like that, which led to her kind of carving out and creating this better life for us. And ultimately, that is what led my mother to start her own company, which has very much paved the way for how I think about entrepreneurship today. So I guess I was around like 10 or 11. We were still living in Wales at the time. And my father at this time had taken a job in England. So he was driving for 2 to 3 hours every week.
Wow.
Then he was living over there and then coming back at the weekends. And my mother was just not very pleased with this idea. She thought that he didn't earn enough money and she was quite desperate to find another solution, one which really would satisfy like all of our family's like financial needs. And so she decided to start her own consulting company working between China and the UK. In the first year, she would just take me on all the trips with her because she didn't have anything else to do with me. And she also didn't have any other employees. So every time she needed someone to write another email, to pick up the phone, to do the accounts, that all fell to me. And it was just really incredibly inspirational watching her start this company, which now has many employees and several £1 million turnover. And it's entirely like a creation out of, almost born out of her necessity, but also her, like, not so much desperation, but just her desire to want something more and better for herself and also for me in life. And that's definitely not the reason why I started my company, but being familiar with the process of how a company started and seeing my mother pretty much do everything in that beginning was incredibly powerful. It's interesting because we have very different lenses. Like I see ADAY and the company that I'm creating as much more on a bigger scale. And I think she sees the company that she's creating as very much like for her. And she hates hiring like new employees and getting other people involved. So we've had lots of interesting conversations about this.
Wow.
Yeah, so I think that was definitely a big foundation of my childhood. But I think the other one was I felt very bullied. Well, I was very bullied even in kindergarten, but definitely through primary school. So, like K-12 grade school. And there were a couple of factors in this. I think one was I was very bright and kind of annoying and very difficult to get along with young kid. But the second part was, we didn't have a lot of money. And I think in school, especially, like there are a lot of fads that happen, right? Like recently we've had fidget spinners, but back then, you had to wear, I think it was like Adidas and Nike track pants were the cool thing to do. And we just could never afford that. And I was always wearing these clothing that, other kids had given me. So it was a lot of hand-me-downs, which didn't really fit me. It had all of these like odd-looking words tacked onto it. And I remember one of the most hurtful things that the kids were saying to me back then was, they said that I lived in a cardboard box. And it's extraordinary to me now that that could be so hurtful, but it really was. And I understand why, right? Like it's them not giving me this sort of just, being on a peer level. They called me homeless and it just felt very not cool. I would say that it probably wasn't until like much later in my life, like maybe even until I got to college, that I felt I'd fit in. But my parents decided that they would both move to England to follow my dad to his new job. And we came across this concept called grammar schools. So these are selective schools, I guess like magnet or charter schools in the US. But you needed to have applied for it like about a year before and taken a test, which hundreds, if not thousands of people would apply for to get in. And obviously like I'd missed that date like several months in the, beforehand. And my mother asked my head teacher if she could, appeal to the other head teacher, and she did. And they granted me an exception. So they said that I could take the test. And if I did like really, really, really well on it, then, maybe I could be on a wait list for the school. And so my mother and I suddenly started like cramming these tests, which we'd never seen before. And I'd never really done any tests like this before. And I remember an order practice test, I barely passed, like let alone like scored high enough to be on a wait list. And finally, like I did the testing day, someone sat in with me in the school library. And it turned out that out of all of the, thousands of girls who took the test, I came in second.
Wow.
And so they offered me a place. And I think that actually at that moment, it was the first inkling that I had that I was smart. Like I also knew I like did fine at school, but you never really know, right? Like what does that really mean? And so I went to England to this new school where there was a lot of testing and everyone taking a smart test to get in. And, even though we were like doing a little bit better in life in Wales, when we got to England, like the skill just completely reset again. Because at this new school, it's all girls, it's selective. Everyone's very fancy because often a lot of the girls, they went to like a private kindergarten school, preparatory school in order to prepare for this test. And there were lots of girls with like ponies, very large estates. And I just never really even see houses of that size before. So I think it was just a constant new lens of, learning what that meant and being exposed to new things. And it was just a constant like era of growth. Like I think this new school had so many different ideas of education and really pushed me in terms of new subjects that were available. And I think I do attribute like a decent amount of my academic success to it. But I think really around this time was when I discovered like the internet and computers and coding. So my father has a PhD in computational mechanics, and he always had a lot of books lying around. So I read some of these books and I taught myself some rudimentary coding, and I met people online in internet chat rooms. And I think it was the first time that I really felt very understood by the world. And, even though these were people that I only knew by like an alias online, I think we were able to communicate in a way that felt much easier because, was without the guise of society and what you were wearing and who your parents were, how much money did you have. And it felt very simple again.
How old were you when you were at the grammar school and learning technology?
So I moved to the grammar school when I was 10. And I must have started, on computers when I was around 11 or 12. And that really continued throughout my time in high school and middle school. And it was really this which like started my interest in technology. Although, I think back then it was being like a very dorky, nerdy teenager and, spending too much time on computers with weirdos in chat rooms. There was definitely like a huge stigma about it.
Yeah.
And I only wish I doubled down more on that, right? Like who knew what the internet was to become.
Right.
And it's interesting because all of those people who I met from the chat rooms, I'm still in contact with now. And, we're still friends. We're like real friends. We've met in person, but they're still the same people. Like, it doesn't matter if you're hiding behind an alias, right? Like beyond ideas of catfish or whatever, like we're still real people and we still have that inherent authenticity.
Yeah.
And I think, around this time was when I had some of my initial academic successes, which later paved the path for me to, apply for Oxford and get in there. And I think that was a huge relief to my parents because they'd sacrificed so much to move to the UK, to like get me to the best schools. And finally I was able to go to like a good college. And I think they in part felt like they'd finished and achieved what they came here to do, which must have been just an incredible feeling for them. But also that, they must have felt that finally they didn't fail with their daughter, because I definitely was very difficult. And especially during my teenage years, I often I'd argue with them a lot. I wouldn't accept any assumptions. I'd occasionally climb out of my window.
Wow.
Yeah, I think I was a very troublesome teenager. And, also throughout this phase was really where I discovered what fashion meant to me. Because, from that primary school lens of not being able to wear the right clothing and everyone always having different clothing to me, we could never afford the clothing that I wanted, right? It wasn't that I wanted anything particularly expensive, but we just never had any spare cash lying around. So I actually went through a period of, I would walk to school every day, which meant I could save my bus fare, which then meant I could, buy something with it. Maybe it was like a teenage magazine. So then at least I could have the vocabulary and the correspondence to be able to fit in with the other kids. And, sometimes with this money, I would buy a pair of earrings or a necklace. But then I discovered eBay. And around that time, eBay didn't correct for misspellings. And there was a lot of arbitrage that you could take advantage of. So what I started really focusing on was 1930s to 1970s vintage fashion and designer fashion, because the clothing, the fabrics, the stitching was still at an incredibly high quality, but people put a real markdown on vintage clothing. So you could still get a pair of Dolce & Gabbana pants that were made in the 1980s for maybe £10, which is an amazing bargain.
Wow.
And what I did was I started flipping the clothing around. So I looked for people who spelled Chanel wrong, Dolce & Gabbana wrong. Let's be honest, who knows how many N's there are?
Right, exactly.
Yves Saint Laurent. And I once bought a Yves Saint Laurent smoking jacket for, I think, under £10.
Wow.
And I resold it for several hundred. And that was really in the power of I would buy some of this clothing, I'd wear it once or twice, and then I'd resell it. And I think, even at that time, I was around, 15 or 16, that entrepreneurship came very easily to me. The idea of buying and selling and how to create value from that. I think even initially, I think maybe at the higher end, I was doing over £10,000 in revenue at that point.
Wow.
And I remember in the end that we had a whole set of my bedroom was just covered in racks of clothing, just specifically for this purpose.
Wow.
So I think that was interesting. So that was the lens at which I went to university with. And towards the end of my high school education, I spent a lot of time on, my own particular interests. So I was very interested in competitive debating at that point. And I started to associate with some friends who were all competitive debaters. I largely all met them on the internet, but they all went to really prestigious private schools, and they had access to way more, resources than I did. So they had debate coaches, and, they would go on these little trips. And it felt very much like something that was always very out of reach for me. I didn't have any of those resources.
Yeah.
So I asked this other girl in my class, her name was Devika, if she would start a debate club with me, and we did. And we ended up still qualifying for some national competitions where we could meet up with my other friends who had debate coaches. And we honestly, we just got trounced by all of them, every national competition. We do fine in the regional stuff, but once it got national, we were not in the same league. But it was nice to still have the opportunity to try.
Oh yeah.
That's the lens that I went to, I guess Oxford with. I was a little younger than the other people because I skipped a year of school. So they had a photograph of me tagged behind a college bar because I wasn't allowed to drink. The drinking age in the UK is 18.
Yes.
But funnily enough, because I think, my college at Oxford in particular, Merton College, was full of these little precocious teenagers. There were actually I think 4 of us who were all under 18 that couldn't drink. So they had little photographs of all of us. But what an extraordinary experience. So I applied to Merton. So you can pick which college you want to apply for at Oxford. And you also pick what major you want to apply for. And you're admitted on the basis of your academic ability for your major. So there's an interview, and you send an essay, writing sample, and there's also a written test. But all of it is done on academic ability. So they don't care about what extracurricular activities you've done or debating competition or whatever. It's just on how good you are for your subject. So I think all of us were intensely nerdy, very precocious, really lacked social skills. And actually in this environment, I felt like I really actually did pretty well because I had a bit more social skills maybe than some of the other people. I don't know. But it just felt like everyone was there for the same purpose, which was we were all intensely academic. And it was really here that I felt like I could really take advantage of the other activities that were on offer, and that a lot of the other kids and I spoke the same language. But I would say only up to a certain extent. And that extent was, again, around what school you had gone to and, in a way, class. And I think this was a whole aspect of the UK that I only saw glimmers of. I saw it when I moved from Wales to England, and I saw that everyone's houses were much larger. That was more of a money thing, right? People just had larger houses.
Right.
And sometimes the kids' ponies. But when I got to Merton, there were several people in my class who had gone to this school near Oxford where Prince William and Harry had also gone to school. And it was, these schools are very expensive. They are largely boarding schools. They cost around, £30,000 a year in tuition.
Wow.
But there were definitely like codes and particular vocabulary that were adopted by these kids that I just didn't know what these words meant. And so I remember on the first day, there's a very funny tradition in Oxford where you have to wear this thing called sub-busk, which is an outfit of black and white in order to attend your matriculation photos and also to do your tests in. But for the men, you have to wear a white bow tie. And obviously, if you haven't gone to like a ridiculously fancy school, no one knows how to tie a bow tie, right?
Right.
So you end up with a pre-tied bow tie where you clip on. But if you're a kid who went to a really fancy school, you obviously know how to tie that bow tie. And so that immediately, already from day one, creates a separation from if you went to like inner city, public state school versus like if you went to a very expensive boarding school.
Right.
And some of these lines, I would definitely say, like even among my 3 years at Oxford, like those lines don't go away, and they're immediately like private and secret societies that exist and drinking societies. And I think as like a Chinese first generation immigrant, it was difficult to get through some of those barriers. And I would say that's like a big reason why I really am very happy living in the US. And, not to skip around a little bit, but, later in life when I went to work for my later boss, Aileen Lee at Cowboy Ventures, it was just an incredibly like nourishing experience to see an Asian woman like really be so admired and respected and really dominate her field in the way that Aileen did in venture capital. And that never existed for me in the UK. Like, I don't think I had a single Asian role model, let alone like an Asian female role model. And it was incredibly and deeply impactful. And there were really like so many women, not just in Silicon Valley, but in the US that I could look up to. And I think now, especially, in this climate to be raising venture capital, there are so many female-focused funds, female-focused entrepreneurship programs that it's much more meritocratic here. It's not perfect, but it's still really, really good. Whereas like, I think the UK still leans towards how aristocratic are you? And there's a great article by Paul Graham, which is one of my favorite ones. It's called Cities and Ambition. And it talks about what city you should live in. And he goes on to talk about, a lot of people pick their cities because they're like, oh, I have a job at Amazon, I should move to Seattle. And, I guess I'll live in this part of Seattle because it has some nice bars and restaurants, and that's cool. But really, the city that we live in, like, encompasses so much more of who we are, right? Like, if I choose to live in New York, what is the city pushing me towards? Who is the person that I'm going to be? And he talks about how New York still, like, in a way, pushes you towards status and money. And in London, it pushes you towards being more aristocratic and aspiring for that. And in like Cambridge, Massachusetts, it pushes you towards like being more intellectual. So each of these cities emanates a different vibe. And Silicon Valley is pushing you towards, power. And that's the lens at which we should choose what city to live in, because it really dictates so much more than that. And so I had a good time at Oxford. I think it was a time that I really struggled with balance, like how much time to spend on academics, how much time to spend on, all these new extracurricular activities. I had real friends for really the first time. And also, I really had no idea what to do in terms of jobs. And I remember asking around all of these people in the year above me, and I asked them, hey, what do you think I should do in life? And pretty much everyone I respected, they told me to go to Goldman Sachs and do investment banking.
Wow.
And I think that was purely because the function of the era that we were in. Like, it was, I think when I asked these people, I went to Oxford in 2005. It was around 2006 that I was looking for help around internships. And we were coming up to one of the biggest booms and later busts in the financial sector and in banking, definitely. But at the time, it was sort of like being an investment banker was like the coolest thing could have ever happened.
Yeah. And were you studying finance, or what did you decide to study in Oxford?
I studied economics and management. I will confess it was not because I particularly had an interest in economics or management. It was because economics and management was the most competitive course to get into. And I was still at a point where I was very insecure with who I was. And so if I saw something that could show that I was better than other people and show that I could be more competitive, I wanted to be able to see whether I could do it. So I think like my initial passion at that point in my life was probably in chemistry or maybe mathematics. But I remember the acceptance rate for those things were much higher. And I wanted to do something where like I could be like, yeah, I beat the other people. And it was entirely out of insecurity. And I think it was, you know, my parents had spent a long time telling me that I wasn't that smart and therefore I had to work really hard to kind of catch up. They had told me a lot that if I lived in China, I wouldn't be able to get into university because I was so stupid. But it wasn't meant as, you know, like an emotional abuse sort of thing. I think they honestly, like, they were just scared for me, right? And I think they thought that if they could tell me that honestly, it would panic me, and so I would have to work harder. And, you know, we've had many discussions about it now. And one thing they keep on telling me was like, hey, you know, when we raised you, we didn't have the internet. So it's not like there was a child raising manual. We just had to do what we thought was best. So, and often that meant like they were just trying to scare and panic me into doing the right thing. Yeah, I think it's an interesting lens on it. So I was studying economics and management. I remember I had my first banking interview with Lehman Brothers, and it was just awful. Like I hadn't really prepared for it. I didn't really know anything about investment banking. I remember there was a whole thing where they asked me, actually, I think a pretty complicated question. They asked me, what is important in like a mergers and acquisitions deal? And I was just like rambling about all of these things. And then the interviewer said to me, yes, but the most important thing is price. And I was like, oh, okay. That. But, you know, like everyone at Goldman was always very kind to me and I always felt like a very good fit from the very beginning. Like they didn't ask me any questions like that. They asked me, how many cows do you think McDonald's would use on a daily basis? So we talked about that and how many cows and how many hamburgers and how many hours the shops would be open. And it felt very cool.
Yeah, they can see how you think that way. I guess that makes sense. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's just a lot of cool brain teasers, but I thought the people were very nice. And everyone at Goldman who interviewed me, I later saw them and worked with them. So I went to Goldman for my internship as well as for full time. I really enjoyed it, to be honest. I thought it was a great place, but you know, I think the most important thing that came out of that was several things. One, it gave me a really good bearing in terms of who I am today. I think I learned a lot from the team and the culture. Two, I had a lot of mentors there who are still my mentors today. There's one woman in particular called Anna Skoglund, who was a managing director on the consumer retail team and is now a managing director on the financial sponsors team, who wrote my references for business school and is still someone I keep in touch with regularly. And she's just been the most fantastic supporter of everything I do today. And three, last but not least, it's where I've met my co-founder, Nina. And we worked on the same floor. She worked around the corner from me. I was in the UK M&A team and she was in the natural resources team. And it was such a beautiful fit even from the beginning. Like we just got along great. We had a lot of the same interests. And when I later left Goldman, you know, into doing a venture capital internship at a fund called Atomico, which was founded by the founders of Skype, she also started to think about moving into venture capital, and she later did at Index Ventures. And it was just a really most awesome thing. And so, yeah, I think out of Goldman, it was a very formative education for team building and team culture. And there are still many tenets of that we have at ADAY today, right? One is around this idea of teamwork and being collaborative. So Goldman was not a star environment. Like everyone was encouraged to be a part of the team. If someone messed up, it was always the most senior person who took the blame. And that's how we are. It was also like a real focus on excellence. Like you would always try your best for the client. I remember so many times, like, you know, being in the office at 3 a.m. and just working through the books and the numbers again and again and again, making sure that there weren't any final mistakes. And that's also how, you know, we exist at ADAY. And, you know, I think as I moved from London to California, I did it primarily because like that's where I saw the future going. But all of that nerdy like teenage years that I'd spent on the internet, it finally made sense. Because when I moved into venture capital, I finally had this like language and vocabulary to speak to all these engineers with. And I remember on the first day in my job, they told me that I was far more like nerdy than they expected me to be. And I thought it was the most beautiful compliment. And while I loved Goldman, I would say I still like didn't fully fit in there. Like I think there were still kind of, you know, secret boys clubs and I still didn't go to the right schools. And I think everyone was very nice to me, but it was really in Silicon Valley and adventure that I really fit in. Like everyone was just a professed massive geek. And it just felt great.
That's great. And so what propelled you to leave Goldman? Because I'm trying to keep track of the timing. And you said around 2006, you were in Oxford, which means that the financial crash is kind of coming up 2008 or 9. So were you at Goldman for that, or did that make you move, or what happened from there?
Yeah. So I joined Goldman in 2008. I did an internship in 2007. And we saw people get fired from our team. We saw the Goldman Sachs share price dip below $100, which was like the first time I'd ever done that.
Right.
But more than that, like the nature of the work that I was doing completely changed. So I think, in healthy environments, it was all about like mergers and acquisitions, who's buying who, like who's trying to defend from who. And suddenly the work that we were doing was like restructurings, debt refinancings. It was saving all of these companies from going under. And I remember at one point we did a piece of work for Punch Taverns, which was a pub chain. So like alcoholic houses, bars. And they had like tens of thousands of employees. And if we couldn't do this financing, they were just all going to go bust.
Wow.
Right? And that's a huge responsibility for like a 20-year-old to work on. But I think it really impressed on me, like I think people always joke about like investment bankers moving money around. I agree. I take those jokes. I think they're very valid. But there's also like, especially during that time, we have to finance these companies. And that was really important work. And so I saw all of the financial crisis. It like really sucked, but more because the conversation in society had come to against bankers. And I think a lot of people didn't fully understand the work that was being done. I also think like on a per hour basis, I was making as much money as someone who worked at McDonald's. So it wasn't like, I don't think I was being overpaid. I just worked a lot of hours. Right. And I think that definitely there were people who had, done crazy financial instruments and solutions, which had kind of helped topple various institutions. But that was not anyone who worked around me. And all I saw around me were people who were slugging 100+ hours a week because, their client had called them and said, hey, we're going to run out of money because all of the assumptions that we had made for this year, they're not going to be the case anymore because, of this whole collapse. And unless you find some sort of new financing, we're going to go under. So it felt very real. And I think Silicon Valley felt not very real. So I left Goldman in 2011. I left because I thought it was a good but not a perfect fit. And a headhunter had asked me to go to a venture capital firm and to interview there. And I thought that was a much better fit for me. And after a few months at a VC firm, I realized that I needed to be in California and Silicon Valley. And so I applied to Stanford for business school in order so I could be out there. And that was a very powerful place for me. And I think it was the first place that I felt really that I found my people. I thought all of the work that was being done was incredibly extraordinary, that, we were changing and creating cultures and creating jobs. And I was among just some really, really smart and incredibly talented people that I had a huge amount of respect for. And I was very grateful to be in that setting and to be able to work and to learn from all of these people. And so, I think during that time, I interned for a lot of different companies. During the summer, I worked for a company called Cloudflare, which is about to IPO. I also met Aileen Lee, who was a partner at Klein & Perkins that summer. And she was in the process of starting her venture fund, which later became Cowboy Ventures. And I helped her start that. But, there were also just like a number of the most supportive mentors. So I had a really good time at business school, like working for a lot of people. I actually spent like relatively little time on campus at Stanford. And I wish with hindsight that I had done more of that. But yeah, I think some of the classes and the professors that I got to know were really extraordinary. And a lot of them are still in touch with me and in contact and helping me with my company, especially Jennifer Acker, who is an advisor to us. When I graduated, I went to work at Poshmark, which is a mobile marketplace. And again, there, like my main boss was an Asian woman. And it was just so extraordinary to just be around all of these, like, I guess, immigrants. And I think one statistic that felt very powerful was in an entrepreneurship class, they shared with us that like immigrants actually do better in entrepreneurship because we have this drive and, thrive and desire to succeed in a way that other people don't. This is just statistically, obviously, like all people do and can succeed. And I felt like that maybe this was something that I felt compelled and called to do. And unfortunately, like I thought I was going to be in Silicon Valley for like the next couple of years. But in the next year, both my parents got cancer.
Oh my.
And they were living in the UK at the time. And so I ended up quitting my job at Poshmark. I left my apartment, I sold my car, and I moved back to London to take care of them.
Wow.
And I just drove them to hospital every day. And it was an incredibly scary time because, both my parents were dying, but like selfishly, I had manufactured like my whole resume and like my whole work experience up to date, and everything like looked really perfect on paper. And here I was unemployed, and it was not really something I'd ever planned for, and didn't know what to do about it. But it was really within this stance that I started exploring, like, hey, do I want to take another job? Is it going to be a startup? Is it going to be venture capital? Or, can I actually take a leap of faith here? And is this going to be the time that I start something? And Nina and I reconnected. She was also in London. She was looking to leave Index Ventures. And that is where ADAY came to be.
Wow.
And I think the key takeaway here is like, we have to always be open and flexible. And I think even when we go into something and it might look like the darkest, grimmest situation, I'm not saying there will always be a silver lining, but we can create a new lens around it. And I think definitely I could have just gone into this thinking, okay, like, let me just be a hospital with my parents every day and be grim. And instead I was thinking like, what else could I do at this time? I have very flexible time for the first time in my life. Like, what could we create out of this? And Nina and I had always been so passionate and focused about e-commerce and fashion. We stayed in touch all the time after Goldman through to Stanford. And we were both so interested in the idea of brand creation. And I think Nina's lens on it was she was a former competitive gymnast at the national level in Germany. And she'd always grown up wearing incredibly comfortable clothing. And that didn't happen as an adult, right? You've always been put in suits and forced on planes and it being so uncomfortable. And I had done a yoga teacher training in California. And that was just interesting because I'd never felt technical clothing before, because the first time I voluntarily worked out was like, at the age of 23 at Stanford. And I think, with that lens, I started to think, what if this clothing was available in the rest of my wardrobe? What if that we could use this fabric innovation and design innovation to create a better wardrobe, one that simplifies the whole idea of clothing for women? And especially, right, like, what if we could keep on improving that clothing, like every cycle over cycle, instead of being wedded to retail? And by going direct to consumer, we can actually go to our customers and take all the feedback and actually create what they want. And that's what we've done today. And we use a lot of fabrics, which are proprietary, made out of plant-based fabrics, beechwood, seaweed, recycled fabrics and bottles. And we have a huge focus on sustainability because this is very much a brand that we built, and it's very authentic for us and everyone on our team. It is a lot of those harmonious values that we have from Goldman about being a very collaborative team and teamwork culture, not having any stars, and really being there for each other, and also a culture of excellence. But really, we are a brand of how does fashion look in the future. And we think that this is the future of fashion is really much about very comfortable, the technical clothing. And we're incredibly excited to create clothing that's versatile and sustainably focused and can really allow all of our customers to do anything with everything.
Wow.
Our top two use cases for our customers are to work and to travel. It really just reflects what lives that we've been looking to do something in.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I'm thinking because you mentioned work and travel. It's like, I'd like to have some more stylish clothing to wear on an airplane that's comfortable, when you're sitting in coach or whatever for hours. And that is great. And you mentioned that the clothing is both stylish and technical. What do you mean by technical?
So we design around problems. So I think traditional fashion designers design around like, let me create this cool dress. And, it's going to be like bias cut and A-line, whatever. So we ask our customers, we have a form that you can sign up online at thisisaday.com, and you can sign up for your wear test, and we just send them surveys, and they say like, oh, well, like I hate it in winter when I'm too cold, but then when I come inside, I'm too hot. And that will be the problem that we design around. And what it means is that all of our fabrics are super technical. So they end up being both thermodynamic, so it keeps you warm when you're cold and also keeps you cool when you're too hot.
Wow.
They'll be sweat wicking, they'll be wrinkle resistant. All of them are machine washable, never ever dry clean only. But that's the like very core basics that we have for all of our fabrics.
Oh, cool.
And so I think, with this lens, right, it's not only that people are wearing their clothing onto a plane, but they start designing the whole trip around what can I pack in the lightest way possible. And our clothing is also pretty lightweight. So it weighs, I think we just launched this new capsule called a carry-on capsule where 5 of the items weigh only 1 pound together.
Wow.
But they'll wear it on the plane, they'll get off the plane and go to their TED Talk. And I think the interesting thing is we've all had this lens, right? Because as we only do women's wear at the moment, we'll do all genders in the future, but we've always been busy as people. And so that's why our customer base really spans all the way from 18 through to 80 years old. Because even though they didn't really have the vocabulary for it back then, I think everyone really understands how important, wearing something that's super versatile is. And it's not really about having the perfect outfit for each occasion, but it's really just about creating more mind space so you can get more stuff done and do other things rather than worry about your clothing.
Yep.
We're not trying to disrupt high fashion. We think that will always exist. But what we do want to make is the best white shirt that's ever existed, the best core staples in your wardrobe, the stuff that you're going to spend 80% of your time wearing.
Wow. And that's incredible. And I'm so intrigued by the approach that you take as a business to creating these different clothing lines between the customer feedback and the iterative development process. It reminds me a little bit of, it's like using design thinking for fashion design and really creating and iterating on this clothing. That's great.
You hit it right on now.
Perfect. Wow. Where can people find and buy clothing from ADAY?
Yeah, so you can definitely find us in New York. We have a showroom now on Canal Street.
Wow.
We are mostly direct consumers. So on our website, this is aday.com. ADAY is the best place. We're also on all the social media, so definitely give us a follow. And as always, I'd love to hear what people think. We'd love feedback, and we'd definitely love to create something for you and your problems.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I'll put the link to the website and your social media in the show notes so that people can find it really easily. Oh my goodness. So yeah, Meg, your story is a really amazing story of resilience and resourcefulness and just, throughout your life, I'm just struck by how you were always able and driven to find those opportunities. And whether that was by the circumstance of being in a place where you felt like you didn't completely fit in, or you just had very large challenges to overcome from, learning a new language all the way to kind of navigating school and finding what you were really interested in and sort of navigating the whole social structure and taking tests. It's just amazing to see what that great intelligence and focus and drive and just resourcefulness can do to build a career. It's just amazing and inspirational to me. And I thank you so much for sharing your story with me and my listeners.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. I think this has been so powerful. I think, one of the biggest learnings I've had is that, I think when I was younger, it was very much like, you do something because something happens, right? You don't really have much choice. But especially as I come into who I am now, I think we get so much more choice in choosing the lens and the perspective on which we want to live life. So we don't have to wait for those opportunities to arrive. We can kind of actually create them. We can constantly ask us, is this the life that I want to be living? How do I grow and how do I want to grow? And I think that is what I'm trying to grow into right now. So thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Beyond 6 Seconds. Please help us spread the word about this podcast. Share it with a friend, give us a shout out on your social media, or write a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast player. You can find all of our episodes on our website, www.beyond6seconds.com. Until next time.